What if one of the deadliest tornadoes in modern American history wasn't just a natural disaster, but a warning that many people didn't fully understand or didn't hear in time? On May 20th, 2013, an EF5 tornado tore through Moore, Oklahoma, leaving behind destruction so extreme it looked unreal. Entire neighborhoods vanished. A school collapsed with children inside. And in the middle of it all, questions began to surface. Why did some people never receive the warning? Why did certain buildings fail while others survived? And could more lives have been saved? This isn't just a story about a storm. It's a story about seconds, decisions, and the thin line between survival and tragedy. What really happened that day will shock you. If you want more real stories that make you question everything you thought you knew, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. The story begins on May 18th, 2013, when a dangerous pattern started to take shape across the Great Plains. Forecasters had already been watching the atmosphere closely, but by that weekend, the signals were becoming impossible to ignore. Warm, moist air surged northward from the Gulf of Mexico, colliding with dry air pushing in from the west. At the same time, powerful winds high in the sky began to shift direction and speed. This combination created a volatile setup that meteorologists know can lead to violent storms. Over the next few days, that tension in the atmosphere would be released in the form of multiple tornadoes tearing across several states. Communities from Kansas to Illinois were hit, but it quickly became clear that central Oklahoma was sitting directly in the path of something far worse. One of the first major warnings came when a powerful tornado struck near Shawnee, Oklahoma, just east of Oklahoma City. This storm reached EF4 strength, with winds strong enough to destroy entire neighborhoods. Homes were flattened, debris filled the air, and lives were lost. It was a clear signal that the atmosphere was capable of producing catastrophic storms. For many residents, this was not unfamiliar territory. The region had already experienced devastating tornadoes in the past, including the historic 1999 Moore tornado, which carved a deadly path through the same area. Still, each new storm carried its own risks, and this one suggested that the danger was far from over. The atmosphere was not calming down. It was building towards something even more destructive. As the system continued to evolve, meteorologists grew increasingly concerned about what might happen next. By the early hours of May 20th, 2013, the warning signs had reached a new level. At around 1 a.m., the Storm Prediction Center issued a forecast that raised alarms across the region. The outlook included a 10% chance of violent tornadoes, meaning EF2 to EF5 strength, within a defined area around central Oklahoma. To the general public, that number might not sound extreme, but to storm experts, it meant one thing. This had the potential to become a historic and life-threatening event. The ingredients were all there. Surface temperatures were expected to climb into the upper 80s, while moisture levels remained unusually high. Combined with intense wind shear, the environment was primed for the development of powerful supercell thunderstorms. By late morning and early afternoon on May 20th, the atmosphere began to respond exactly as predicted. Thunderstorms started forming along a boundary known as a dry line near Chickasha, Oklahoma. Most storms in this kind of setup tend to compete with each other, weakening as they collide. But on this day, one storm stood out. A single supercell developed in near-perfect isolation, allowing it to grow stronger without interference. It fed on the surrounding energy, pulling in warm air and intensifying with each passing minute. Storm chasers in the area quickly noticed its structure. A rotating updraft became visible, and the storm began to take on the classic shape associated with the most dangerous tornado-producing systems. This was no ordinary thunderstorm. It was becoming something far more dangerous. At 2:40 p.m., the situation reached a critical point. The National Weather Service issued a tornado warning for Moore and surrounding communities, giving residents roughly 16 minutes to prepare. Local schools had already taken precautionary steps earlier in the day. After reviewing the forecast, officials decided to cancel afternoon dismissals and keep students inside under shelter protocols. That decision would later save many lives. Still, not everyone received the warning. Some people had their windows closed against the heat, muffling outdoor sirens. Others underestimated the threat or delayed taking action. Studies later showed that thousands of residents never heard the warning, and many who did failed to seek immediate shelter. Meanwhile, radar screens showed a tightening circulation within the storm. A hook-shaped pattern became clear, signaling that a tornado was either forming or already on the ground. There was no more time left for hesitation. The conditions had aligned, and the storm was ready to strike. At 2:56 p.m. on May 20th, 2013, the storm made its move. A tornado touched down near Newcastle, Oklahoma, just a few miles southwest of Moore. What began as a rotating column of air quickly intensified as it moved northeast. Within minutes, it grew wider and more powerful, tearing across open land and heading straight toward densely populated neighborhoods. Radar images showed a growing debris signature, confirming that the tornado was already causing significant destruction. Storm chasers on the ground reported that it was expanding rapidly. This was no weak storm building strength slowly. It was already dangerous, and it was getting worse by the second. As the tornado approached more, it began to strengthen dramatically. By 3:15 p.m., it crossed into the western edge of the city with devastating force. Winds climbed into the range of an EF5 tornado, strong enough to rip apart buildings and toss vehicles through the air. Moments later, it intensified even further. Entire neighborhoods were engulfed. Homes that had been built to withstand strong storms were torn apart in seconds. Roofs were peeled away, walls collapsed, and debris filled the sky. Survivors later described the sound as overwhelming, like a constant roar mixed with crashing metal and breaking wood. The tornado was not just passing through, it was erasing everything in its path. One of the first major structures hit was Briarwood Elementary School. The building took a direct hit as the tornado reached EF5 intensity, with winds estimated between 200 and 210 miles per hour. Large sections of the school were destroyed as the roof was torn away and walls crumbled under pressure. Inside, teachers and students had taken shelter in interior areas, following emergency procedures. Despite the complete destruction around them, everyone inside survived. Rescuers later pulled children and staff from the rubble, shaken but alive. It was a rare moment of relief in an otherwise overwhelming disaster. The survival of those inside showed how critical those shelter decisions had been, even against such extreme forces. Just minutes later, at 3:20 p.m., the tornado struck Plaza Towers Elementary School, and this time the outcome was far more tragic. Around 75 students and staff were inside, taking cover in hallways as they had been trained to do. When the tornado hit, the building could not withstand the pressure. The roof was torn away and walls collapsed inward. A section of the school that had been considered a safer area gave way under the force. Teachers tried desperately to protect their students, some using their own bodies as shields. Despite their efforts, 7 children lost their lives inside the school. The loss was devastating. Families across the community would soon face the worst kind of news. In just a few minutes, lives were changed forever. The destruction continued as the tornado moved deeper into Moore. Residential areas were flattened, including entire blocks where well-built homes were completely swept from their foundations. In the Westmore neighborhood, the tornado reached peak intensity. Trees were stripped bare, grass was torn from the ground, and nothing recognizable was left behind. Vehicles were thrown long distances, and debris was scattered across wide areas. Businesses along major roads were also destroyed. A 7-Eleven store on Telephone Road was hit, resulting in multiple fatalities when the structure collapsed. Nearby, the Moore Medical Center suffered heavy damage as windows shattered and parts of the building failed, but everyone inside managed to survive. The scale of destruction was staggering, affecting homes, schools, businesses, and critical infrastructure all at once. At its peak, the tornado reached a width of 1.3 miles, making it one of the widest tornadoes ever recorded. Winds remained in the EF5 range, capable of leveling even the strongest structures. Entire commercial areas vanished within seconds, including stores, restaurants, and offices filled with people just moments before. Storm chasers who had been documenting the event began to realize the true severity of what they were witnessing. Some abandoned their cameras to warn others or help people evacuate. The atmosphere of excitement that sometimes surrounds storm chasing disappeared, replaced by urgency and fear. This was no longer a spectacle. It was a disaster unfolding in real time. By 3:28 p.m., the tornado crossed Interstate 44, tossing vehicles and damaging anything in its path. After nearly 40 minutes on the ground, it finally began to weaken as it moved into less populated areas. At around 3:35 p.m., the tornado dissipated east of Moore, leaving behind a path of destruction nearly 14 miles long. What remained was a landscape that barely resembled the city from less than an hour earlier. Entire neighborhoods were gone, and emergency responders were just beginning to grasp the scale of what had happened. The storm had ended, but the crisis was only beginning. In the immediate aftermath, the full impact became clear. 24 people had lost their lives, including children, families, and individuals caught in homes and businesses. Hundreds more were injured, many seriously. Roads were blocked by debris, communication systems were disrupted, and countless people were trapped under collapsed structures. The city of Moore had been struck at its core. In less than an hour, a thriving community had been transformed into a disaster zone. In the moments after the tornado lifted at 3:35 p.m., the silence across Moore, Oklahoma, was broken by calls for help coming from every direction. Dust still hung in the air as people began to emerge from what was left of their homes and workplaces. Many were injured, disoriented, and searching for loved ones. Others were trapped beneath collapsed walls and debris, unable to move. Emergency responders rushed in, but the scale of destruction made it difficult to reach everyone quickly. Roads were blocked, landmarks were gone, and entire neighborhoods were unrecognizable. What had been a busy suburban city less than an hour earlier was now a field of rubble and broken structures. In those first minutes, survival depended on whoever was closest, not just trained professionals, but neighbors helping neighbors. Rescue efforts began almost immediately and quickly grew into a massive operation. Local police, firefighters, and medical teams were joined by the Oklahoma National Guard, federal agencies, and responders from nearby cities. Volunteers poured in as well, many of them ordinary citizens who felt compelled to help. People used their hands, tools, and anything they could find to dig through debris, searching for survivors. Teachers who had just survived the destruction of their schools began looking for their students. Parents moved from one collapsed building to another, hoping to find their children alive. Hospitals across the region worked non-stop to treat the injured, even as some facilities had been damaged themselves. There was no pause, no moment to process what had happened. The focus was entirely on saving lives. As the hours passed, the extent of the damage became clearer. Entire sections of Moore had been wiped out. More than 1,100 homes were completely destroyed, and thousands of other structures were damaged to varying degrees. Businesses that had once lined busy streets were gone, leaving behind only scattered debris. Schools, churches, and medical facilities were among the many buildings affected. The financial cost was enormous, with damages exceeding $2 billion, making it one of the most expensive tornadoes in United States history. But beyond the numbers, the human cost weighed even heavier. Families were left without homes, without belongings, and in many cases, without loved ones. Every destroyed structure represented a story, a memory, a life that had been changed forever. In the days following the disaster, Another unexpected threat began to appear. Some survivors developed serious infections from cuts and injuries sustained during the storm. These infections were traced to contaminated debris and soil that had been driven into wounds by the powerful winds. Doctors identified rare fungal infections that required immediate and aggressive treatment. It was a reminder that even after the tornado had passed, danger still lingered. At the same time, recovery efforts continued around the clock. Temporary shelters were set up for those who had lost their homes, and donations began arriving from across the country. Volunteers helped clear debris, distribute supplies, and support families in any way they could. The response was not just local, it became a nationwide effort to help more recover. As weeks turned into months, the focus shifted from rescue to rebuilding. City officials and community leaders began planning how to rebuild stronger and safer than before. One of the most significant changes came in building standards. Moore became the first city in the country to require storm-safe rooms in new homes, designed to withstand extreme winds. Schools were rebuilt with reinforced structures and dedicated shelters to protect students and staff during future storms. Hospitals and public buildings were redesigned with improved safety features. These changes were not just about replacing what had been lost. They were about learning from tragedy and reducing the risk for the future. At the same time, the community worked to honor those who had lost their lives. Memorials were created, including a park at the site of Plaza Towers Elementary School, where the 7 children had died. Families gathered there to remember, reflect, and support one another. Public ceremonies brought thousands of people together, showing the strength and unity of the community even in the face of grief. Survivors carried both visible and invisible scars. For many, the emotional impact would last far longer than the physical rebuilding process. Certain sounds, weather patterns, and even the sight of dark clouds could bring back memories of that day. Recovery was not just about rebuilding structures, it was about healing people. Over time, Moore began to transform. New homes replaced those that had been destroyed. Businesses reopened, and schools welcomed students back into safer buildings. Parks and public spaces were restored, bringing life back to areas that had once been covered in debris. Children returned to playgrounds, and families slowly rebuilt their routines. While the scars of the tornado would never fully disappear, the city showed a strong commitment to moving forward. Within a few years, Moore stood again as a functioning and vibrant community, shaped by what it had endured, but not defined by it. Even more than a decade later, the events of May 20th, 2013 remain deeply rooted in the identity of Moore. The disaster changed how the city prepares for severe weather and how its people respond to it. Awareness, readiness, and community support became central to daily life. The lessons learned came at a high cost, but they continue to guide decisions and actions. When storms approach now, there is a greater sense of urgency and understanding. The tornado took lives, homes, and years of memories, but it also revealed the strength, courage, and resilience of a community that refused to give up. The Moore tornado didn't just destroy buildings, it changed lives, policies, and the way an entire city prepares for the future. Behind every statistic is a story of loss, survival, and courage that still echoes today. Some questions were answered, but others remain. And when the skies darken again, those lessons will be tested once more. This story proves one thing above all: disasters don't just happen. What follows defines everything. If you found this story powerful and want to uncover more real events that go deeper than headlines, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next story.